Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Kayleigh Haywood. She was a young girl who just suddenly disappeared one weekend in 2015. When Kayleigh was reported as missing and the police began investigating her case, it was ultimately her social media profiles that would play a huge role in establishing Kayleigh's last movements and identifying a suspect. And following this came the realization that not one but two people were responsible for Kayleigh's disappearance and, as it would turn out, her tragic murder. But quickly before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a teenage girl and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards women, the rape and sexual assault of a minor and grooming. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back about 8 years now to November of 2015 in Ibstock, which is a little town located in northwest Leicestershire in England. And this is Kayleigh Haywood. She was a teenage girl who lived in Leicestershire with her family. Specifically, Kayleigh lived in a village called Measham, and Measham was described as being a very nice area to live. It's quite a small little village, very tight-knit, just a friendly area which felt safe. But back to Kayleigh. So Kayleigh Haywood was born on the 6th of August 2000 to her parents Martin and Stephanie, and she had 6 siblings in total. I think she had just one little sister and then 5 brothers, so she was from a very big family and she loved her family to bits. Of course, she would have the occasional disagreement and argument with her siblings, as siblings do, but overall she was very, very close to them and family meant everything to her. Kayleigh was also very close to her parents, her father Martin and her mother Stephanie, and Stephanie described her relationship with Kayleigh as almost being sisterly in itself. Of course, they were mother and daughter, but it was almost like they were sisters too, and best friends, because they loved spending time together. They loved doing very girly things together, like going shopping and stuff. Growing up, Kayleigh was described as just being a very kind and bubbly young girl, and very, very headstrong too. Her mum Stephanie said that she wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in and stand her ground on things. She could apparently be quite mouthy sometimes, her mum's words, not mine. And yeah, all in all, it appears as though Kayleigh had a very nice, happy childhood. I'm sure she had a very fun childhood growing up with as many siblings as she did. However, it was when Kayleigh entered her teenage years when life took a bit of a negative turn for her, because that was when she started having some trouble at school. She was bullied in school. Several of her peers would make fun of her. I think they would comment on her size and her weight and just call her horrible names. And this was every single day. Every single day she would go into school and she would just be picked on relentlessly, which is awful. But she wasn't just picked on. It wasn't just verbal abuse, verbal bullying that she experienced, because they would also do things like throw bottles of water at her and over her. They would spit on her, just vile stuff like that. And so, of course, naturally, Kayleigh never wanted to go in. She hated school. She just wanted to stay home all the time where she felt safe. And so her parents soon decided that they had to take their daughter out of the school that she was in and move her to another one. And thankfully, when she did start at another school, it was completely different for her. She didn't experience any bullying at this new school. She soon made some friends and she was just so much happier in this new environment, and school was finally enjoyable for her again. She could enjoy being a teenager and doing all the typical things that teenage girls do. Going out with friends, shopping, talking about crushes, being active on her phone and social media. Life was looking up for 15-year-old Kayleigh Haywood. that was until this case occurred. The date was the 13th of November 2015. It was a Friday, the end of a school week, and that Friday afternoon, Kayleigh asked her parents if she could please go and stay with one of her best friends at their house that night, if they could have a sleepover. And her parents were very familiar with this friend, so they said yes, they were happy for Kayleigh to go. And so that evening, her father Martin drove Kayleigh to a local leisure centre because Kayleigh had said that her friend was swimming at the leisure centre that evening. So Martin dropped his daughter off in the leisure centre car park, he said goodbye, and with that, Kayleigh walked away. Now, the plan initially was to only stay at her friend's house for one night and then return to her home the following day. However, the 14th of November rolled around and Kayleigh sent a text message to her mum Stephanie asking if she could stay around her friends that Saturday night too, and then she'd come home on the Sunday instead. And again, Stephanie said yeah, that was fine. She didn't mind her daughter staying with her friend another night. In fact, she was happy that her daughter was having a good time and enjoying herself. But this happiness that Stephanie felt was rather short-lived, because on the Sunday, the day that Kayleigh was supposed to come home, Stephanie was contacted by Kayleigh's friend, the friend whose house she had supposedly been staying at for the last 2 nights. And what this friend told Stephanie suddenly made alarm bells ring. The friend basically rang Stephanie on that Sunday morning and she asked her if Kayleigh was home, which of course confused Stephanie, and she said, no, she's not here. She's supposed to be with you at your house. She's been staying with you since Friday evening. But this friend responded saying, no, she's not been with me. I haven't seen Kayleigh in a couple of days. So it seemed as though Kayleigh had lied to her parents. She told them on the Friday evening that she was staying with this friend, but clearly she hadn't been. So why had she lied? And if she wasn't with this friend, then where was she? Who was she with? Of course, her parents were very, very concerned at this point. However, concern just grew even more when this friend told Stephanie that Kayleigh's phone had actually been found. Earlier that same morning, the morning of the 15th of November, a builder who was working in the village of Ibstock, which is only about 5 miles away from where Kayleigh lived in Neasham, he discovered a white iPhone with a smashed screen just discarded on the ground in the street. And so he decided to try and work out who the owner of the phone was so that he could give it back to them. He checked the call history on this phone and he rang one of the last numbers on there, which was Kayleigh's best friend, the friend she was supposed to be staying with. The builder told her friend the situation, that he had found this phone, and the friend, realising that it was Kayleigh's, got in touch with Kayleigh's mother Stephanie. And that was when it came to light that Kayleigh wasn't where she told her parents she had been. In fact, she was missing currently. No one had any idea where she actually was, where she had truly gone on that Friday evening. And now, just 2 days later, her phone had been found basically smashed up. So understandably, her parents were very, very panicked, and they quickly decided that they had to call the police and report their daughter as missing. So the report was made, and of course the police took this very seriously because a child was missing. Kayleigh was just 15 years old, so this was a high priority. So they quickly appealed to the public for information, and they took statements from Kayleigh's family, her parents, just to kind of find out more about Kayleigh and her life. Who were her friends? Did she have a boyfriend? Was she active on social media, etc, etc? To which her parents responded yes. Like every other teenager, Kayleigh was practically glued to her phone and she was always scrolling through social media, which gave the police, I guess, their first line of inquiry to pursue. They thought that if they looked through her phone and her social media messages, perhaps that would give them some insight into where she had actually gone that weekend. And it did. You see, when the police checked Kayleigh's Facebook, they found that in the lead up to her disappearance, she had been in contact with a man, a stranger online. And in fact, the messages between them revealed that she and this stranger had actually planned to meet on that Friday, the evening of Friday the 13th of November. This man's name was Luke Harlow, and he and Kayleigh first came into contact with each other about 2 weeks before Kayleigh went missing on the 31st of October 2015. That day, Kayleigh received a new friend request from this Luke Harlow, and despite the fact that Kayleigh didn't know Luke personally, she accepted this friend request, which I feel like actually isn't too uncommon, especially for teenagers, to accept friend requests from people that you're not actually friends with. So Kayleigh probably didn't think anything of it at the time, but quickly she received a message from Luke Harlow which just basically said, "Hi, how are you?" And Kayleigh responded. She said hi back, and she asked how Luke knew her because she didn't recognize him. And apparently he said something along the lines of, "Oh, we've got a mutual friend, I'm a friend of a friend." So they continued messaging, and one thing that immediately stuck out to the police when they were reading these messages and the conversations between Luke Harlow and Kayleigh Haywood was that very, very quickly Luke started calling Kayleigh babe and baby in his text to her. And as well as that, he also started calling her princess and calling her beautiful. He asked if she had a boyfriend, and when she said no, he would say things like, "Oh, how have you not got a boyfriend when you're so pretty?" He would end every single message with a load of X's to represent kisses. It was very obvious from Luke Harlow's messages to Kayleigh that he was trying to flirt with her. Pretty much immediately when they first started messaging, he was flirting, which I'm sure Kayleigh probably really enjoyed. Of course she did. She was a teenage girl, so of course she was going to enjoy the fact that this boy was flirting with her over message and sending her loads of compliments. She liked having that kind of attention, and it would have been pretty harmless flirting if not for the fact that Kayleigh was 15 years old, a child, and Luke Harlow was 26 years old. He was a fully grown adult man and he was flirting with a teenage girl over Facebook. Although Kayleigh did actually lie to Luke Harlow at first. At one point when they first started talking, Luke did ask Kayleigh how old she was, and she apparently said that she was 19. She was also an adult, which again, not really unlike teenagers, is it, to lie about their age. I definitely lied about my age when I was younger. Not saying that it's okay to do that, but I definitely did it when I was that age because you do want to be seen as older. You want to be seen as mature and an adult. However, it didn't take long for Luke Harlow to somehow work out that Kayleigh was much younger than she claimed. I mean, he probably only had to look at her pictures to realise that she wasn't 19, and so he did confront her in the messages about this, and she admitted that yes, okay, she was actually 15. Now, of course, that right there should have been the exact moment when Luke Harlow stopped messaging Kayleigh. He had been sending her all of these compliments, being very, very flirtatious over text, but the minute that he found out that she was actually 15, that is when he should have stopped all of that because he now knew that she was a minor. But as it turns out, Luke Harlow did not stop messaging Kayleigh after this. Despite the fact that he now knew that she was a child, he did not stop with the flirty messages, and instead he just told Kayleigh that she couldn't tell anyone about the fact that they were messaging each other because then he would get into trouble. So that shows that he knew full well that what he was doing was wrong. Paying her all of these compliments, telling her that she was stunning and beautiful, calling her pet names like princess and baby. To Kayleigh, those messages obviously mean a lot. Like I said before, she likes the attention that she's getting from a boy. She's flattered by his comments, but being as young as she was, she couldn't see this situation for what it really was. Grooming. Luke Harlow, this stranger from the internet, was grooming Kayleigh Haywood, and it wasn't long before the flirtatious messages from Luke Harlow turned sexual. He would message Kayleigh saying things like he wanted her to come round his house and take all of her clothes off, how he wanted her naked in his bed. He would talk about all the sexual things that he wanted to do to her. In fact, here is an exact quote. One of his messages to Kayleigh read, "We need to have drinks soon, babe, so that I can get you drunk and take advantage." And here is another quote. He said, "I'd cuddle you all day, but I'd be too tempted to do naughty stuff if you was in my bed naked, lol." And I just want to mention again that he was sending her these messages knowing full well that she was a child. Even after finding out that she was just 15 years old, the sexual comments did not stop. In fact, if anything, it appears as though they just increased and increased. And he would constantly suggest to Kayleigh in the messages that she came round his house, that they met up. And as it turns out, that is exactly what they planned to do on the very same weekend that Kayleigh went missing, the weekend beginning the 13th of November 2015. Kayleigh had lied to her parents saying that she was staying with a friend, but in actual fact the messages on her phone showed the police that she had actually arranged to go to Luke Harlow's address and stay with him. And we can guess that she probably lied to her parents because she knew that they wouldn't let her go if they knew the truth. Of course they wouldn't. And also remember, Luke Harlow kept telling Kayleigh in the messages not to tell anyone about their relationship, because if she did, then he would get into trouble. So she was doing as he said. She was keeping it their little secret because that's what he wanted. So now the police had their first person of interest in Kayleigh's case. They were sure that whatever had happened to Kayleigh, this Luke Harlow must have been involved. And so they went to speak with him. They went to his home. He lived in a house in the town of Ibstock in Leicestershire. Now, when they arrived at his address, unfortunately, there was no sign of Kayleigh, but the police asked Luke if he could please accompany them down to the police station to be interviewed about her disappearance, and he agreed to that. He was very cooperative with the officers, to be fair. So they sat Luke Harlow down in the station and they just began asking him questions about his relationship with Kayleigh. When did they start talking? Why did they start talking? Who messaged who first, etc, etc.
And how did you become friends on Facebook? How did that come about? I can't remember if I added her or she added me. I'm not 100% sure. But like, I've got loads of people on it, and I have a habit of accepting anyone who tries, you know what I mean, regardless of whether the name rings a bell or anything. I've got like 2,000 odd people on it. But I'm not sure whether she added me or I added her, but basically as soon as we were friends on it, we just started talking, just like, oh hey, how are you?
The police asked Luke Harlow about the messages that he had sent Kayleigh, particularly about the ones that were very sexual in nature. Although it turns out actually that when the police seized Luke Harlow's phone and they had to look through it, he'd actually tried to delete a huge chunk of the messages. There were more than 2,000 messages between them, and before he was interviewed, Luke Harlow had gone on his phone and he deleted all of the messages in which he had made sexual comments towards Kayleigh. But obviously the police had already seen those messages by this point on Kayleigh's Facebook. So again, that just shows that Luke Harlow fully understood the consequences of his actions. He knew that what he was doing was wrong because he had tried to delete the evidence. And then the police began asking Luke about that weekend, the weekend in question, and he fully admitted that, yeah, Kayleigh had come round his house, and he gave his account of what happened. So Luke Harlow said that on the Friday evening, Kayleigh came to his home. She obviously stayed over that night. He said that they drank alcohol together. Luke admitted to the police that they did sexual stuff, as he put it, which, I mean, even if Kayleigh said yes to, obviously couldn't have been consensual because she was underage. She was too young to give consent, which he knew. And then he said that the following day, the Saturday, Kayleigh agreed to stay at Luke Harlow's another night. So as we know, as we discussed earlier, she messaged her mum Stephanie asking if she could sleep over at her friend's house that Saturday night too, and Stephanie said yes. And Luke Harlow told the police that that Saturday evening they drank again. They drank more alcohol. However, he said that they soon ran out of drinks, and so he decided to go and ask one of his neighbours if he had some alcohol or some drinks that they could mix with this bottle of vodka that Luke had. His neighbour was a man named Stephen Beedman. He was 29 years old and he lived in a flat, I think just behind Luke Harlow's house. So Luke knocked on Stephen's door, asked him if he had any drinks, any alcohol, and he said that he needed it because, in his words, he had a bird round his house and they were getting drunk together. They were having a bit of a party, which clearly intrigued Stephen Beedman. he told Luke Harlow that he didn't have any drinks, but that he would go to the local shop with him to get some, and then he would accompany Luke back to his address to meet this bird. So the two of them brought more alcohol, they went back to Luke's flat, and all three of them were drinking together. And then Luke's account was that at around midnight, so Saturday night going into the early hours of Sunday morning, he became very tired. He was very drunk from all of the alcohol that they had consumed, and so he decided to just go to bed. He was going to go to sleep. And he claimed that when he went to go to his bed, he left Kayleigh and his neighbour Stephen Beedman in the lounge. They were just sitting together in the lounge, and Luke said that the following morning when he woke up, there was no sign of either of them. They were both gone. So Luke's story was that the last time he saw Kayleigh, she was in the company of Stephen Beedman, and he said that he had no idea what happened to her after he went to bed on the Saturday night. So now the police had a second person of interest, this Stephen Beedman, who the police were of course very keen to speak to and interview as well. Now Stephen wasn't at his flat when the police began trying to look for him, but they eventually traced him, I believe, to a family member's house in another town in Leicestershire called Colville. Once they found him, he was actually arrested, as was Luke Harlow. Both men were arrested on suspicion of kidnapping Kayleigh Haywood, and then Stephen was taken to the police station where he was questioned and asked for his account on the night that Kayleigh vanished, which actually was very different from Luke Harlow's, or at least the ending was different. So Stephen gave basically the same account as Luke Harlow and said that on the Saturday evening he went back to Luke's address with him and they drank with Kayleigh. However, he claimed that he left Luke's address around midnight and that when he left, Kayleigh and Luke were sitting in Luke's lounge together. So Luke was claiming that the last time he saw Kayleigh, she was with Stephen, and Stephen was saying the opposite, that she was with Luke. So one of these two men had to be lying. But which one was it? Who was the liar here? Well, the police soon suspected that it was actually Stephen Beedman who wasn't being truthful, that he knew more about that night that he wasn't telling the police. And the reason for this was because of his appearance. You see, as soon as the police arrested Stephen Beedman, they actually noticed that he had a load of injuries on his face, some pretty bad injuries. It almost looked like he'd been beaten up or something. So the police asked Stephen about these injuries, how did he get them? And he apparently said something along the lines of, oh, I fell over whilst I was at work and I banged my head. He worked as a landscape gardener, and yeah, he just said that he had had an accident at work. However, as you've probably guessed, the police did not believe this. They believed that this was a lie and that he may have actually sustained those injuries during a struggle with Kayleigh. If Stephen Beedman did something to Kayleigh, attacked her or possibly even killed her, then perhaps these injuries to his face were from where she was trying to fight back, fight for her life. So that was one reason why the police suspected Beedman of lying about his story from the night in question. And another reason for their doubts was because of witness statements that the police soon obtained from Luke and Stephen's neighbours. Obviously, as part of their investigation, the police began conducting door-to-door inquiries around the area where Stephen and Luke lived, just in case anyone who lived nearby had any information. Maybe they'd seen or heard something from that night which could have possibly been related to Kayleigh's case. And as it would turn out, they did. You see, a couple of the neighbours did tell the police that on that Saturday evening, they heard a load of like banging and crashing about. They'd heard the sound of someone shouting and screaming, and these noises seemed to be coming from the direction of Luke Harlow's house or around that area. And they said that they'd heard these noises around like 9 to 10 p.m. that evening. And then there was another witness who lived nearby, and he told the police that later that night, actually in the early hours of the Saturday morning, he happened to look out of his window onto the street outside, and that was when he saw some kind of altercation between a man and a young woman. He actually saw the man pinning pinning this young woman to the ground, and she was barely clothed. She was not dressed appropriately for the weather and the temperature outside. Obviously it was November, so it would have been so cold, and yet she was only wearing like a t-shirt and possibly a short skirt. The man couldn't really tell, but he could see that she had nothing covering her legs. She just had bare legs. She must have been freezing. But anyway, he saw this man pinning this young girl to the ground, and initially the witness thought that this man was a police officer, and that's why he looked as though he was kind of restraining this girl. However, eventually the two of them got back up. The man helped this girl up off of the ground, and then they started walking away together, arm in arm. And it was then when this witness thought, oh, maybe it's not a police officer, maybe it's a young couple and they'd had a bit of an argument or something, and so there was a struggle between them, and then they'd made up, and that's why they walked off together. And so for that reason, the witness at the time didn't think much of it, and they didn't call the police or anything. But as I said, they later told the police about this incident that they had seen that night during the investigation into Kayleigh's disappearance. And when the police heard this account, they theorised that this man and woman that had been seen that night were Kayleigh and Stephen Beedman, that Stephen had pinned Kayleigh down on the ground. I believe because the description of the man that the witness saw was similar to Stephen Beedman's appearance. So the police asked Stephen about this. They told him about this altercation that the witness described, and they asked if it was him and Kayleigh, and he said no, it wasn't them. He denied it.
I'm being quite honest with you. We don't know where Kayleigh is. We don't know if she's injured somewhere. We don't know if she's not alive, if she is alive. And we urgently need to find Kayleigh Haywood. If you know her, if you indeed know where she is, to tell us right now at the beginning of the day.
No.
You don't know where she is?
I don't know where she is. I met her Saturday night at 8. At 7, 8 o'clock. We only down 4 hours. And she was that drunk, I couldn't get much conversation out of her. She'd been with Luke on Friday. She stayed around there Friday apparently. Saturday. He knocked on my door. I got a bottle of pop. I said no, why? Because I've got a burglar round. I've had her around since Friday. We got wrecked last night. And I've got a big bottle of vodka.
So it was clear that Stephen was not going to admit to anything anytime soon. But of course, time is of the essence here because Kayleigh is still missing. The police still have no idea where she is. And so whilst detectives continued questioning both Luke Harlow and Stephen Beedman, other officers were out physically searching for any sign of Kayleigh. More than 400 officers were drafted in to assist with the inquiry, and they were searching along the streets and in fields, wooded areas, in bodies of water. Sniffer dogs were brought in, and actually it wasn't just the police out searching. Several members of the public came forward and offered their help too. They volunteered to help search. Naturally, news of Kayleigh's disappearance spread very, very quickly around the area and surrounding areas, and the whole community just really, really came together to help in any way that they could, help find Kayleigh and bring her home to her family, who were, of course, just absolutely distraught and sick out of their mind with worry. And eventually something was found. It wasn't Kayleigh, but it was an item of her clothing. I believe just a couple of days after Kayleigh's disappearance, a member of the public was walking their dog along a pathway in an area not too far from where Luke Harlow and Stephen Beedman lived, near Sense Valley Park in Ibstock. And as they were walking, they spotted this pink bra just discarded on top of this bush or undergrowth, and it was clear from how the bra looked that it hadn't been in this area for very long. It wasn't dirty or anything. It looked in pretty good condition, and due to the location where it was found, near where Harlow and Beedman lived, as I said, the police, when they were informed about this discovery, they had their suspicions that perhaps this bra was Kayleigh's. So they took a picture of it and they showed this picture to Kayleigh's family, her mother Stephanie, and tragically Stephanie was confident that yes, that bra did belong to her daughter. And of course, this was very alarming, the fact that her bra had been found. I mean, the discovery of any item of her clothing just discarded in a bush would have been cause for concern, but the fact that it was her bra of all things, that was very worrying. That indicated that whatever had happened to Kayleigh that night was probably sexual in motive. The fact that her bra had been removed suggests that whoever was responsible for her disappearance likely sexually assaulted her too. About 3 days after Kayleigh went missing, on the 17th of November 2015, obviously the search for her was still ongoing, and on this particular day the police decided to search this lockup at a premises which was just under 10 miles away from Ibstock, because this lockup actually belonged to Stephen Beedman. He owned it or rented it or something. A lockup, by the way, is like a big storage unit or storage container which people can use to keep some of their belongings or property in, which I guess they might not keep in their home or have room for in their home. So upon learning that Stephen Beedman had one, the police were very, very keen to search it. They even thought that perhaps Kayleigh may have been inside of it. If he kidnapped her that night, maybe this lockup was where she was being held hostage. In fact, the police were able to determine through the CCTV footage from this lockup facility that Stephen Beedman had actually been there later on that Sunday that Kayleigh disappeared. So they really, really thought that there was a high chance that he had hidden something there, possibly hidden Kayleigh, like I said. So the police went to this premises, they opened Stephen's lockup, and disappointingly, once again, there was no sign of Kayleigh. She wasn't found in his flat when that was searched by the police, nor was she discovered in this lockup. And they didn't really find anything else in the lockup in the way of evidence either. Apparently his lockup was very tidy. And yeah, they didn't find anything in there which seemed to be relevant to the case. Or at least not inside of the actual lockup itself. You see, just outside of the lockup facility, the police noticed that there was a skip which people would obviously dump their rubbish and their garbage in. And when the police looked inside of this skip, they saw a load of rubbish bags, obviously, and right on top of these rubbish bags, there was a handbag and a t-shirt. And once again, when these items were shown to Kayleigh's mother, Stephanie, she confirmed that yes, they belonged to her daughter. This was Kayleigh's t-shirt and Kayleigh's handbag. So this was strong evidence to implicate Stephen Beedman. The fact that Kayleigh's belongings had been found in a skip outside of the premises where he owned a lockup. The lockup that he had been to on the same day that Kayleigh vanished, that was solid evidence linking him to her disappearance. It was clearly him who had dumped these items in this skip in an attempt to dispose of evidence. And the evidence did not stop there, because as part of their investigation, the police also decided to conduct a search of the area where they knew Stephen had been working. So as I mentioned before, he worked as a landscape gardener, and if you recall from earlier, he said that the injuries to his face were as a result of an accident at work. He said that he was working on this farm in a village called Bolton in Leicestershire, which is about 7 to 8 miles away from Ibstock. So the police decided to go and search this farm and the area around it, and it was during this search when they discovered a bonfire with a load of items inside of it. Well, it hadn't actually been set on fire yet, but it was all in this pit ready to be lit at some point. So the police had to look through these things in the bonfire, and they found some men's clothing, and this clothing had blood on it. And they were quickly able to establish that this clothing belonged to Stephen Beedman. In fact, they were even able to determine that it was the very same clothing that he'd been wearing on the Saturday evening that he went to Luke Harlow's address whilst Kayleigh was there. Because if you remember, he and Luke Harlow went to a local shop that evening to pick up some more alcohol, and they were caught on CCTV cameras in this shop, and the clothing that was found in the bonfire was the same clothing that Stephen was seen wearing on the CCTV. And when the blood on this clothing was tested, it came back as a match to missing Kayleigh Haywood. Her blood was on Stephen Beedman's clothes. And even though Kayleigh still hadn't been found, I think the discovery of this blood-stained clothing just confirmed everyone's worst fears, that Kayleigh had most likely been murdered. It had been days since she was last seen alive, and now that this clothing had been found, it really was looking like she was probably sadly deceased. So it was following the discovery of this evidence when both Stephen Beedman and also Luke Harlow were re-arrested on suspicion of Kayleigh's murder. The police were obviously certain at this point that if Kayleigh was dead, Stephen Beedman was definitely involved in her death. But I think they were a little bit unsure at this point exactly what Luke Harlow's involvement was here. I mean, he was obviously the one who groomed Kayleigh and I suppose lured her to his house, but was he involved in her death? They didn't know just yet, but he was arrested for murder anyway as the investigation continued. And it appears as though it was when Stephen Beedman was confronted with all of this evidence, particularly the blood evidence on his clothing, when he began to crack. Obviously, as we know, up until this point, he had been denying everything. He denied knowing what happened to Kayleigh, denied knowing her whereabouts. He was adamant that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But after the police found all of this evidence, which strongly suggested otherwise, it was like he realised that there was no point in him trying to deny this anymore when the evidence against him was just mounting and mounting. And so, on the evening of the 18th of November 2015, about 4 days after Kayleigh vanished, 29-year-old Stephen Beedman made a confession. He finally admitted to the police that, yes, Kayleigh was in fact dead, and he knew that she was dead because he was the one who killed her. And following this, he told the police the location where they would be able to find Kayleigh's body. He claimed that he had left her in a field which was just opposite Sense Valley Park in Ibstock. So the police headed to this area that same evening and they began looking for Kayleigh. And this was difficult. Obviously, it was nighttime, so it was dark outside. There was a lot of undergrowth that they were going to have to go through. It was not great conditions to be out searching for a body in, I suppose. It would have been much easier for them to search in the daytime when it was light. However, the officers were not prepared to postpone this search. Now that they knew the general whereabouts where Kayleigh was, they were just like, we can't leave this till morning. She's already been missing for days. We have to push through and find her tonight, even if it means searching for hours in the darkness. And so the search began, and they were searching for a good few hours until eventually, just after 10 p.m. that night, they found her. The body of 15-year-old Kayleigh Haywood was discovered on an embankment in this field, surrounded by thick undergrowth. She was practically completely naked when she was found. The only thing that she was wearing was one of her socks. She was lying in quite an unnatural position. Apparently, she was kind of half on her back and half on her side, so her body was almost twisted, and it was immediately clear just from looking at her body that her death had been incredibly brutal. She'd been viciously beaten with some kind of heavy object. Her nose was broken, her jaw was broken. She'd clearly been beaten around the head repeatedly, and it was later determined in her autopsy that tragically Kayleigh had also been raped by her killer. But my God, did this girl put up a fight. She was said to have had self-defense injuries all over her hands from where she had tried so incredibly hard to defend herself and fight for her life. She was fighting Stephen Beedman right until the end, but unfortunately it was a battle that she would lose. So now that Kayleigh's body had finally been found, her family were obviously informed of the tragic news, and the men responsible were formally charged in relation to her death. Stephen Beedman was of course charged with her rape and murder, whereas the charge of murder in Luke Harlow's case was dropped because, I mean, even Stephen Beedman himself admitted that Luke was not involved in her death. He admitted that it was just him and him alone who killed Kayleigh. So Luke wasn't charged with her murder, however he was charged with both grooming and 2 counts of sexual activity with a child. And Luke Harlow was also later charged with 2 additional counts of grooming too, because it was found that Kayleigh was not the only one that Harlow had sent inappropriate messages two, he'd also been messaging 2 other young girls and trying to groom them as well. But before we go into their court proceedings and everything, let me just fill you in on the police's theorised version of events, what they believed happened on the night that Kayleigh was killed. And this is based off both Stephen Beadman's own account, his confession, and also other evidence. So obviously we know how things unfolded up until the point when Stephen Beadman arrived at Harlow's flat that evening. And it's believed that Luke Harlow invited Beadman over to almost brag to him and show off the fact that he had a girl round his flat, to show off that he was a ladies' man, even though the lady in question was a literal child. So Beadman came round the flat. The 2 men probably plied Kayleigh with alcohol and encouraged her to keep drinking, because then it would obviously be easier for them to take advantage of her. And it's thought that Stephen Beadman probably tried it on with Kayleigh at some point. He tried to kiss her and touch her, and that she resisted. She tried to push him away. And it's believed that the 2 men tried to hold Kayleigh hostage in the house for a period of time that evening. And the reason the police have theorised this is because of those screams and loud banging noises that neighbours heard at around 9-10 p.m. It's thought that the person screaming was probably Kayleigh. She was probably trying to get away from Harlow and Beadman and leave Luke Harlow's flat because of the fact that Beadman was trying to touch her. And so it's thought that the banging noises may have been her struggling with the 2 men, and they tried to restrain her and stop her from leaving. Maybe they panicked and thought that if she left, she would go to the police and they would be arrested. However, sometime later that night, in the early hours of the Sunday morning, the police theorised that somehow Kayleigh did manage to escape, and she ran out of that house basically half naked. The police believed that she was only wearing a long t-shirt and nothing else, not even any underwear on her bottom half, probably from where she had been assaulted. So she ran out of the house, and it's believed that Beadman chased after her, and unfortunately he managed to catch up with her and literally tackle Kayleigh to the ground. And that was when she dropped her phone, which was of course later found by a builder. And that is what the other witness saw. Remember, he described how he believed he had seen a policeman try to restrain a young woman, but then he thought that it was actually a young couple having a bit of a tiff, because he then observed them walking away together. It's believed that that was Stephen Beadman and Kayleigh Haywood.
Are you having to control her by hold her as she walks independently?
At this point, she's walking independently.
But up until that point, and how are you managing to control her?
Pulling her out.
By your hand? Alright, okay. Are you using anything else? Is it just your presence? Is there any weapons?
Now that Stephen had Kayleigh in his clutches, he took her towards Sense Valley Park, and in the car park there, Stephen admitted to the police that he raped Kayleigh, and that's why her bra was discovered just discarded on top of some undergrowth nearby. It's believed that after the rape, he walked her into the field or wooded area opposite, and that was when Kayleigh once again tried to make a run for it. She was able to free herself from his arm and literally start running for her life. And when Stephen caught up with her this time, he said that Kayleigh was actually armed. She had found a brick on the ground, and so when Stephen tried to attack her again, she hit him in the face with this brick, and that is what caused the injuries to his face, the injuries that he originally claimed he had sustained during an accident at work. Following this, Stephen said that he managed to wrestle the brick off of Kayleigh, and then ensued a violent struggle between them. Stephen began beating Kayleigh around the head with this brick, and she was trying to defend herself. She was probably shielding her face as much as she could, and that's why she had so many defensive wounds on her hands. But Kayleigh really had no chance of escaping now, and obviously with each hit, she was just getting weaker and weaker until eventually she died as a result of her horrific injuries. And once she was dead, Beadman just got up and he walked away. He just left Kayleigh's naked body there in the field. And as we know, afterwards, he tried to dispose of the evidence. He planned to burn his blood-stained clothes in that bonfire. He ditched Kayleigh's handbag and t-shirt in that skip outside of the lockup facility, and then he just carried on with life as normal. And when he was questioned by the police, he tried to act none the wiser, claiming that he had no idea what had happened to Kayleigh until, of course, the evidence caught up to him. And I mean, he really had no choice but to confess. When it came to the men's court proceedings, they both decided to plead guilty to all of their charges, bar one. So as we discussed, Beedman was charged with rape and murder, and Harlow was charged with 3 counts of grooming and 2 counts of sexual activity with a minor. And the men admitted all of that. They pleaded guilty to all of those charges. However, in addition to that, the police and the prosecution also felt that they had enough evidence to charge both of them with false imprisonment too. As I touched on before, they strongly believed that the screaming and the loud banging noises that were heard that night proved that the 2 men had held Kayleigh hostage for hours in Luke Harlow's flat, and so they felt that they should be charged with false imprisonment too. But both men denied this. They claimed that Kayleigh wasn't held captive and that she was free to leave the flat whenever she liked. And so whilst they pleaded guilty to all their other charges, they both pleaded not guilty to the false imprisonment charge, which obviously meant that they would both have to go to trial for that. And thankfully, they were both convicted and found guilty of the false imprisonment charge. And as a result of that and all their other charges, they were sentenced to the following. Luke Harlow was sentenced to a total of 12 years for his offences, and Stephen Beedman was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years, which would have meant that he wouldn't become eligible for parole until the year 2050. However, as it would turn out, Beedman would ultimately only spend about 6 years in prison in total, because in April of 2021, he actually died whilst obviously still behind bars. According to sources, his cause of death was a sudden cardiac arrest and cerebral hypoxia. In the aftermath of Kayleigh's murder, it was realised that what happened to her in the lead up to her death was not uncommon for teenagers to experience. Grooming of children is not uncommon, and unfortunately one of the disadvantages of social media is that it has made grooming even easier for sexual predators like Luke Harlow. In fact, it was even found that before this case occurred, Luke Harlow was not the only man that had been grooming Kayleigh online. According to articles, another man, 20-year-old Bruce Cordwell, was also in contact with her, and he was sending her inappropriate sexual messages. He was ultimately convicted for this and sentenced to 43 months in prison, although this was later reduced to just 12 months. And as I've said a couple of times throughout this video, Kayleigh was none the wiser. She had no idea what was really happening to her. To her, the messages that she was getting from Luke Harlow, and I imagine this other man, were nice. She liked getting this attention because she was a teenage girl, so of course it was going to be exciting for her. But she had no idea that actually, no, these 2 men aren't just harmlessly flirting with her. They were trying to take advantage and groom her, groom a child for sex. And this wasn't just happening to Kayleigh, this was happening to so many young children and teenagers all over the world. So Kayleigh's family knew that something had to be done to make teenagers more aware of the dangers of the online world, more aware of the predators that could be lurking behind a screen. And so, alongside the Leicestershire police, the police force who obviously investigated Kayleigh's case, they made Kayleigh's Love Story, which is a short film or documentary about what happened to Kayleigh and how some, what she obviously thought were innocent messages from a guy on Facebook, ultimately led to her horrific death. Kayleigh's Love Story was made to try and spread awareness of the dangers of social media, the dangers of meeting people that you chat to online, and just to educate children on grooming. And this film, Kayleigh's Love Story, has been shown to young people and teenagers in schools all over the country, even all over the world. In fact, the video on YouTube alone has more than 4 million views. And I can say from a personal viewpoint that it does have an impact, because I actually vividly remember watching Kayleigh's love story back when it was released shortly after Kayleigh's passing. I believe when I was in school. I'm just slightly older than Kayleigh, and I can recall being shown this video, and it really opened my eyes as a teenager as to the dangers online. In fact, it made me realise that even I had received messages from strangers on the internet, strange men that at the time I didn't think anything of, but then when I watched this video, it gave me that whole different perspective. So this film really does serve its purpose. I'm unsure if it's still being shown in schools now. I hope it is. But if there are any parents watching this who have young children, teenage children, I would really encourage you to sit them down and have them watch Kayleigh's love story and chat to them about it afterwards. Chat to them about the dangers of social media. So I will of course leave a link to the video down below in the description box. I think it's absolutely amazing, and I really applaud the Leicestershire police and of course Kayleigh's family for making it and spreading that awareness. I can only imagine that the video alone has saved so many lives, saved so many kids from experiencing grooming too. And that concludes this case. That is the case of Kayleigh Haywood. A really heartbreaking case, but again, it's incredible that something positive has come out of it. Kayleigh's love story has made such a huge impact, and again, like I said, probably has saved so many lives. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases. Drop them down below in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.